Welcome back. Thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Getting close to that 1,000 subscriber mark, so I really appreciate it. I should get there probably around this video, maybe next video. So my last two videos on differential regearing, one was on a Dana 60 with a shim style pinion. The second video I did was a 14 bolt, and though it is a crush sleeve style differential, we did a crush sleeve eliminator in that. This third video is I am regearing a Dana 30, which is in a later model Jeep JK. And I say later model because it was built in this century. I'm a little bit old school at this point. So to me it is late model, but I think it's a 10 or 12-year-old Jeep. Now the Dana 30s were in the non-Rubicon Jeeps, but the Rubicon and the non-Rubicon, the difference is the front has a 30 versus a 44, and the rears were both 44s, but in the Rubicons they had the electronic lockers in them. But as far as setup goes, these pretty much all set up the same. So if you're going to do one of these late models with a crush sleeve, this is really going to be a very concise, pretty easy video to follow. Once you get your axle shafts pulled out, the cover off and drained, make sure you mark the bearing caps. They are line bored, and if you put them in the wrong positions, you will ruin bearings and things like that. Once you have the caps off and marked, go ahead and pull the carrier out. You noticed I really didn't have to work very hard to get this carrier out. It kind of slid out. I've been running into that more and more on these newer differentials. They don't have any preload. After the carrier's out, pull the pinion out. Now you have an empty housing to work with. Now we can get started on the new gears. There's a couple things I'm noticing on these newer Dana differentials with the crush sleeve. First thing to be cautious of, if you can pull the carrier out and there's no preload on those side bearings, I'm seeing that a lot from factory setups. When you go back together, add some preload. Make sure those bearings have a little bit of preload on them. That can cause a couple bad things. If that doesn't have any preload, you can get some chatter back and forth on the carrier, and it will really screw up the backlash at some point, especially if you get some wear in those bearings. The other thing with no preload I've seen happen is that inner race will start spinning on the carrier. It'll work itself loose from being bounced around in there a little bit. So make sure you get some preload on those carrier bearings. Now, the other two things I'm seeing a lot on these crush sleeve differentials is a big washer that kind of looks like this. Some of them will have these three tangs to center it on the pinion. Some of them won't. But they are between the inner pinion bearing and the head of the pinion. And those are in there to move the pinion further away from the inner bearing race. I am guessing it's probably a clearance issue from the factory with specific gears, but if you have one of these washers between the head of the pinion and that pinion bearing, make sure to either transfer it or measure it and put another washer in between that pinion head and the bearing. If you don't, you're going to be adding a pile of shims to that inner race to compensate for your pinion depth, because this will affect pinion depth. However, if you add those shims to that inner race, and there is a clearance issue, you may be, fighting yourself on that. This next thing I'm seeing on a lot of these is these big flat washers, which are inserted in the same location as your pinion depth shims. And what these are doing is they are creating a reservoir in the upper side of that pinion housing. And you've got the other washer, like this one, that goes on the outside of the outer pinion bearing. Both of these are there to kind of help slow oil down. They keep oil up in that pinion longer, better, all the time, whatever the case may be, which helps oiling those high pinions. If you have one of these in there, be careful when you remove that inner race to change your pinion depth. Most of the time you hit these with a punch, it destroys them, and you really don't want to just smash them with a hammer and flatten them back out. It can definitely change your pinion depth. What I usually do is I'll measure this and I will add that many shims to my inner race until I get the correct pinion depth set up. Then I will take those shims back out and insert this flat washer on my final assembly. So those are the things I'm noticing a lot on these newer differentials. So just be aware. Make sure you look up the torque specs for the differential you're working on. Torque wrench and an inch-pound wrench are your friends in doing differentials. It'll really make a big difference in the final product. Inspect the ring gear and look at the bolts. These are serrated, so technically I don't have to use Loctite, but I put some Loctite in the holes of the ring gear anyway. I go to assemble it onto the carrier next, and the really refreshing part is these don't require near the torque like the Dana new 44s or the 14 bolts or the 60s. So this one was really easy, and I was able to keep track of it really easy and went around it 2 or 3 times just to make sure. As you noticed, I usually mark all the bolts, and I kind of got lazy on this one and didn't. I pressed the original bearing off of the original pinion because it has this thrust washer or spacer washer. Now, that's the only reason I pressed this off, because I have new bearings, but you do have to transfer this to the new pinion gear. It will drastically change your pinion depth if you don't. The other thing I wanted to point out is both of these pinions have 0.0 on the head. That means theoretically, I should be able to put it together with the same shim pack and it set up just like it was originally. We'll see if that holds true here. Yes, I know this sounds like a broken record, but forget about pinion depth as the pinion too deep or the pinion too shallow. Set your pinion depth up based on too close or too far from the ring gear. It is far easier to figure out. I love this little pamphlet. It's very good. Even if you don't like some of the patterns, an acceptable pattern. What you don't want are the harsh lines in the root or harsh lines on the crown. That will tell you if your pinion's too far or too close. Pinion depth by theory is different than pinion depth by practical application. So I just always use pinion too close, pinion too far. Save yourself the headache that way. Now, I see this happen all the time. People assemble their pinion with the new crush sleeve in it before they actually get their pinion depth set up right. All I am doing here is I am assembling this pinion gear without the crush sleeve. I am tightening it up, torquing it to a point where there's no play in the pinion, and I have some preload on the bearings. Then I'm going to set my pinion depth and make any adjustments before I do a final assembly with a crush sleeve. Now, initially, I have not moved any of the shims out of that inner race, and I am going to see if the original shims get me to the right place or if I have to make any adjustments. Starting with the original shims is always an easy, good place to start. That'll give you an idea if you need to move that pinion closer or further from the ring gear. Next step, I am installing the carrier. Now I'm using the original shims for the backlash, but I did discover if you push those in and the gear gets tight, you'll have to swap them left to right sometimes, and I actually did have to do that on this one in order to get some backlash. Now, the carrier is sliding in and out really easy. I don't have to use a pry bar or a puller or anything. I do use a hammer to tap those thick shims in all the way. Just makes it a little easier. But these carriers, I'm finding they're not putting much preload in from the factory, and that can lead to other issues with deflection, with your backlash not maintaining. It can also cause those inner bearing races to come loose and start spinning, which can do damage to the carrier. Once I'm in, put the bearing caps in their correct orientation. I'm going to tighten these bolts down just with my little impact. It's only 35-ish pound-feet. So again, I'm not doing a final assembly. I just want to get my pinion depth checked. Now, marking paint, just like the other differentials, a nice thin coat. Don't goop it on. You only need about 3 teeth. Now, this particular differential, I put the carrier in using the original shims, and I did have to swap them, but I'm a little bit sloppy on the backlash. So I will have to adjust that to get a really clean pattern, but at least it'll give me an idea what direction I need to go. Now, when looking at the pattern on these, a lot of these new gears will wipe the tooth on either the heel or the toe, and it'll be opposite from coast to drive side. And that's okay, that's just how they were machined. What we aren't looking for is harsh lines on that marking paint. We are looking for a nice round pattern from the root to the crown. It doesn't really matter where it's placed heel to toe. Once we're ready, I put some resistance on the pinion to load it up, and I am going to run my ring gear 3 or 4 times back and forth through that marking paint, and then I will get a good idea of whether my pinion is too close or too far. And based on the number on the pinion gears, it should be pretty darn close to on the money. If you look at this pattern, you can see that harsh line in the root. That tells me my pinion gear is too close to the ring gear. On the coast side, it's not as noticeable, but because I have excessive backlash, it kind of drags that wipe mark to the outside or the heel of the gear. That'll correct when I adjust my backlash. But for now, I am going to have to remove the carrier, remove the pinion. I will remove probably about 5 thousandths. It's not too far off on that pinion gear. I'll reassemble it, and let's run another pattern. Okay, you can see the coast side dialed right in there, and the drive side also dialed right in. Now, I'm looking at it's coming in nice and smooth, heel to toe. There's no harsh lines on the crown or the valley. The only harsh line you can really see is the tooth. Now, my backlash is a little bit too tight, so I will adjust that on my final assembly. But for now, I am comfortable that I have an acceptable pattern. If you're uncomfortable with your pattern at this point, set your backlash correctly and then recheck it. But once you do a few of them, you kind of get to where you know. Old crush sleeve and new crush sleeve. Now, if you measure them, there is a slight difference in height because the old one has been crushed and it does not return to its normal. If you just eyeball them, there's not much you can see. Now, if you run into troubles with a crush sleeve not wanting to crush, and I have had this happen, you can put it in a press and just a little oomph on it and get it kind of to start the crush, and then put it in the differential to finish crushing it to the correct preload. I don't recommend that. I try to do it in the housing. There's also a couple tricks I will share with you about using an old crush sleeve, but we'll go into that later. For now, let's get this pinion gear in the housing and get the crush sleeve a-crushing. Now with the pinion ready to go in, you've got your new crush sleeve on there. Your outer bearing is already in the housing in the new race. Your new seal is pushed in. You've got that upper oil retaining washer in. And be careful sliding the pinion through that oil retaining washer. Once you get everything kind of held in place on the pinion side, you can slide the yoke on and start tapping it until you get a few threads showing. Once you get a few threads showing, you can start tightening the pinion nut down. And at this time, make sure you're using your new pinion nut and your new washer. I get the pinion nut snugged down by hand, and then I use an impact. Now, I don't try to tighten this down with an impact to the point that I am getting my pinion preload. I'm only tightening this down enough to, number one, hopefully start the crush sleeve, but mostly just to take the play out of the pinion gear. Once I got the play out, I leave the impact aside and I finish this by hand. Using a breaker bar to crush the crush sleeve, you do have to hold the yoke in place. Now you can use a pipe wrench. This particular case, I used a couple of sacrificial bolts in the yoke and a pry bar up against the frame, and that gave me the ability to literally hang on a 30-inch breaker bar and tighten the yoke, crush the crush sleeve until I obtained the correct inch-pound reading for my pinion bearings. Once you obtain the correct preload, check it with your inch-pound wrench and leave it alone. You're all finished up now. You don't want to take this back apart and you don't want to over-torque it. I will give another real strong piece of advice when you are doing these crush sleeves. Go in small increments, check them often. If you're not sure, put the inch-pound wrench on it, every 8th turn. Once these crush sleeves start crushing, they go really fast, and it is really, really easy to over-torque them. With the inch-pound wrench, I check it, and I've checked it a couple times, going up in increments. My spec on this with used bearings is 8 to 12, and my new bearings is 5 inch-pounds higher. This particular one, I have got it right on the money. I also run it around a few times by hand and make sure it is smooth. Remember, this is a final assembly. Everything is done here. New seal, all your oil washers, everything is done. So at this point, you don't want to take this back apart. Now let's set the carrier in and get the backlash dialed in for its final. The spec on the backlash on this Dana 30 is 6 to 10 thousandths. I set this up with my original shims. Now remember, I am going to have to move it a couple of thousandths, and not only move it a couple of thousandths to tighten it up, I am also going to have to add some shims for preload, so keep that in mind. Initially, you can also try this. Just adding shims to the passenger side will push that gear towards the driver's side. It may take up some of that slop and add your preload at the same time. Doesn't work very often. Now I know I need to add a couple of thousandths to the preload of this. So if I just add those shims to one side, I may be able to not only get my backlash correct, but I can also get my preload set correctly. So first thing I'm going to do is measure my original shims and kind of figure out mathematically what I need to do. If I can use one of these original thick shims, I will. I always prefer using the thickest shims I can when I can. In this case, I'm not going to be able to use at least one of these shims. So I will measure the one that I think is the closest to being correct. I may have to add a couple of thousandths to it. Now, I always set my dial indicator on 0 and then add what I need to and figure out if it's a couple thousandths different. If you're using a digital caliper, just figure out the number you need based on the thickness of your original shim. Then come up with a combination of shims that will accommodate that thickness. Now, if you've got thick shims and thin shims, make sure to put your thin shims between the thick shims, because these shims go on the outside of the bearing race, not on the inside like the Dana 60 did. So I've now got this combination, which I think will work on the one side, and I am going to use the original shim on the other side, and we will see where I'm at on my backlash. Keep in mind, I did add enough shims to create preload on this setup. Now, putting this carrier in, I did gain enough preload that I'm happy with the preload. I had to tap the shims in and then seat them with, a little punch. Now, don't get overboard with your punch, by the way. Now I can put the bearing caps on. Now I'm just snugging these enough to take up all the play in the carrier. Now I'm going to check my backlash, and I have discovered that I'm a couple thousandths loose. So what I'm going to do is pull this back out, take 2 thousandths out of one side and put it in the other side, and now here's where we end up. Remember, the spec on this is 6 to 10, so you put the dial indicator right on the corner of the tooth, hold the pinion in place, move your ring gear, and we are right at 7.5 thousandths. So I am within spec. Now I am going to torque my bearing caps down, and I will take a final pinion depth pattern just to verify my work. Now with my backlash set to spec and my bearing caps torqued to spec, I'm running another pinion depth pattern just to verify my work. Theoretically, it shouldn't change, but once you've done enough of these, you can kind of make them change to your benefit. So here's where we're looking at now. The drive side is centered well and no harsh lines. It's coming in and out well, and the coast side is equally centered and there's no harsh lines. That gear is coming in smooth and going out smooth. My pinion depth stayed right where it's supposed to be. And a final check on backlash, make sure it didn't move. The last thing I'm going to do is run this around a few times, make sure everything is smooth like it's supposed to be. If something gets stiff, check it with a dial indicator, make sure you have good run out. This one's a good to go, so put the cover on, button it up, and add fluid. Okay, I said I would throw out a couple of tricks there for a crush sleeve. First thing I would like to say, if you think you might have to take one apart again, if your spec on a preload for a crush sleeve is, let's say, 15 to 30 inch-pounds. If you set it at 15 and you had to take it apart, chances are you could then set it to 20, 25, or 30 and get away with using that same crush sleeve again. Doesn't happen very often. The other thing you can do, if you have one, you can add a shim to the one side or the other of your crush sleeve and continue crushing it to a point of preload again. So that's the other trick. The third trick I have is if you have an old kingpin or something like that that's really solid, you can lock it in a vise, you can set the crush sleeve over it and literally go around the whole thing a couple, 3 times, and you have to smack it pretty hard, but you might be able to flare it out just enough to then again crush some preload into it. Those are the only 3 tricks I really have if you're trying to save yourself on a crush sleeve. Most of the time you end up having to get a new one. Again, that's why I really prefer crush sleeve eliminators. Save yourself some headache if you ever have to take them apart again. All right, that's going to do it for the Dana 30 crush sleeve style regear. Between these 3 videos in this little series, that should cover a pretty broad span of differentials. So if you're ready to jump into doing one, go for it. Worst case scenario is you have to do it twice. How do I know? I've done it that way. But thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And if you have questions about differentials, throw it in a comment. I will answer anything I can. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.